Hi, everybody. This is week 9, and this is part 2 of what I call tools of analysis. Part 3 is going to be next week in week 10. And so, what I call this week is bridging between rational and non rational approaches, or what are called non rational approaches. So, don't confuse non rational with irrational. More of a psychological term when we talk about humans being rational or irrational in their thought. This is just really two different approaches to solving problems, to making decisions, and to policy analysis. And, sometimes you could think of them as mutually exclusive, but sometimes you can think of them working together. And that, frankly, that's the way I prefer to think of them. So let me get into this lecture, and I think you'll see what I mean. And then this week, we're going to return to our standard discussion format versus an exercise. Um, I I know that the two exercises we did were challenging, but that's fine because I think that those are important skills that we needed to talk about in terms of research and policy analysis. So let me just get into the subject for today. Okay, so I had you read from this Clemens and Macbeth text for which I provided you the PDF. And this week, I had you read chapter 3. I'm sorry, chapters 2 and 4. Last week, it was chapter 3. So this week, we're reading chapters 2 and 4, wherein Clemens and Macbeth talk about the rationalist approach. Now, I will tell you that I think Clemens and Macbeth, their leaning is towards the non-rationalist model. And so sometimes you might get the idea from the tone of the writing that they're very much opposed to the rationalist model. I don't know that that's true. Again, I will tell you that I think in policy analysis, we have room for a lot of different ways of analyzing alternatives. And that really is what I'm leading to. Your policy analysis project gives you the opportunity to define a problem, then to do some research into the problem, and then to present some alternatives to the problem, and then to analyze those alternatives through some criteria of evaluation, and then to make a judgment as to which alternative you think is the preferred alternative based on how each alternative stacks up against the criteria that you have established. And so while I'm on that subject, just a reminder that the next part of your policy analysis project will be the part where you build from the policy definition to presenting alternatives and coming up with criteria for evaluation. And that's due on March 18th. And so when you go to the syllabus and go to the assignments tab, you'll see that I'm not wanting you at this point yet to tell me which is your preferred alternative. What I'm wanting you to do on this next phase is to rewrite your problem statement based on what I suggested when you turn that in, and then to say, okay, based on my problem, here are the alternatives, and here are the ways, the criteria by which I will judge my alternatives. And then at that point, I really don't even want you to say, and based on this, I pick option 2 or whatever. I just want you to say how you're going to do that, and then we'll have some dialogue on that. And then finally, you'll present the entire project. So the rationalist model is as opposed to what Clemens and Macbeth call the non-rational model. So this model really has a basis in public administration history. So think back on when you took the 80-50 class, the Foundations of PA class. Remember Luther Gulick in the 1930s. Remember Woodrow Wilson in 1887 writing about a science of administration, and Luther Gulick coming along in the 30s and talking about his principles or science of administration. And so all of that very much had this foundation in something that we called the politics administration dichotomy, and I'm sure you remember talking about that. And so what that really implied was that politics was kind of an unpredictable sort of rough and tumble sport, wherein uh, elected leaders ended up making policy, and then administrators carried those policies out in a neutral fashion. Um, and so whether that's realistic or not, that is really what the politics administration dichotomy describes. But Dahl came along in 1948 along with Simon, and perhaps you read some of what Simon wrote uh, criticizing Luther Gulick. Dahl came along in 47 or 48 and said, how do we separate facts and values? That's the real question, not necessarily politics and administration. So what Dahl was talking about was, in all the decisions we make in politics and in administration, there is some sense that values are being inserted. And so it's impossible, according to Dahl, to completely separate politics and administration. Um, and then you can think about rationalism and the US government in the 1960s. And Clemens and Macbeth talk about this a little bit. But if you recall back a few weeks in week 3 in this course, I had you read one chapter from a book by Radin. Um, and that book talked about the history of policy analysis. And what she was referring to was in the late 1950s, early 1960s, much of the policy analysis at the federal government level really started in the Department of Defense. It was the introduction of what we called the planning, programming, and budgeting system, which was a budgeting system that was based in analysis. So what it was supposed to do, what it purported to do, and it's still used today, is link uh, defense planning with the programs that support those plans and with the budgets that support those programs. And so it was all supposed to be very rational, that you could work in either direction really to be able to tease out how each budget item connected with some element of planning. Um, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in the 1960s was very influential in introducing quantitative measures, and this was during the Vietnam War. Clemens and Macbeth, if you read this chapter 2 here that I asked you to read, they contend that McNamara and his DoD was not nearly as rational and quantitative as popularly imagined in a lot of books. Um, and in fact, they quote Stanley Carnow, who was actually one of the premier authors who wrote the history of the Vietnam War. And Carnow, blamed some of the failure in Vietnam on McNamara's overemphasis on quantitative measures. But Clemens and Macbeth say, well, really, maybe McNamara wasn't as quantitative and rationalist as all that. So what is this rationalist model and what does it hope to achieve? Well, really, let's think about this in a couple of ways before we get to policy analysis. First of all, the rationalist model, the rational model of decision making, we sometimes call the comprehensive rational model. What it hopes to achieve in any endeavor, whether that's business or nonprofit or government, is to make the right decision, the very best decision. And so how do you do this in the rational model if you're the decision maker? Well, first you define the problem, right? You talk about how serious is this problem? Who does it affect? What are its consequences? What's the scope of it? What's the history and background of the problem? And then you would gather evidence and expert analysis to talk about how we can further, finally define the problem. And then you would operationalize goals so that they can be achievable and prioritized. So what is the goal of what you're trying to solve? And then, can you write them in such a way that you can prioritize them? And then you would list alternatives or possible courses of action. You develop criteria for evaluating those courses of action, and you evaluate each one equally, excuse me, using the same kind of criteria. And then you select the preferred alternative. So what this looks a lot like, by the way, is kind of the classic thesis or dissertation outline, which is a 5-chapter book, if you will. The classic thesis or dissertation is 5 chapters. Chapter 1 is your introduction, wherein you would lay out the problem, you would write your thesis statement, and you would list your hypotheses. Chapter 2 is your literature review, Literature review is a not very good word for saying what the experts have to say about it, pro and con, or maybe there's more than 2 points of view. There might be several points of view. But what did the experts have to say? Chapter 3 is methodology. Excuse me, I do have a cold. Methodology. So, what criteria and methods will I use to examine and test my hypotheses? That's what methodology is. And chapter 4 is findings. So, how did my hypotheses respond to my methodological tests? Um, and, if I'm doing a regression, how did the regression work out? Did I find statistical significance? Were my hypotheses, can I reject them, or can I accept them? And then finally, conclusions. Now that I know all this, what do I have to say about the problem after all of that? What do I conclude about it going forward? What are the implications? So really, that classic approach to a dissertation is also a rational kind of model. So last week, we did this cost-benefit analysis. We really just did this basic cost-benefit analysis from chapter 3 of this Clemens and Macbeth book. And I do recognize that that might not be like some other CVAs you've done, and that's fine, because there's different ways of doing that. But we took this approach where we said, okay, we want to decide whether we want to build a new homeless shelter, or we want to try to keep our old homeless shelter, which needs a lot of maintenance work every year, if we want to keep that one around. And so just using cost factors, and a discount rate, using cost factors and benefits, we determined which one of those approaches would be best. So theoretically, a cost-benefit analysis is exactly like this balance scale or this seesaw, right? If you monetize all your costs and you monetize all your benefits and you apply them equally to policy 1 or policy 2 or decision 1 or decision 2 or project 1 or project 2, any of those things, it basically removes you from the equation, if you will, because it's a rational approach, and the winning policy or the winning project or the winning decision will outweigh the other one. So it is a completely rational statement of all costs, all benefits, and the discount rate. Well, as we know from doing this discussion last week in this exercise, that sometimes the development and monetization of costs and benefits becomes very vital. And sometimes that's actually quite difficult, because how do you monetize things like a drop in the delinquency rate of children if you're going to do a community center? How do you monetize a reduction in homelessness for the homeless individuals? And so it becomes a very difficult exercise. And we can't necessarily say that the assignment of costs and benefits themselves is always completely rational, can we? Because there are some value judgments that go into that. So let me kind of circle back to what Clemens and Macbeth were saying about McNamara, because it relates to what I just said about costs and benefits. So the classic critics of the McNamara era in the Department of Defense and the Vietnam War was that McNamara was too rational and quantitative, and that a complicated human endeavor, such as warfighting, it is a very complicated human endeavor because you're talking about, using violence to settle ideological differences, that it can't be reduced to a simple cost-benefit analysis. But again, Clemens and Macbeth contend that it wasn't that rational, that political ideology was really inserted into these analyses. What were some of these ideologies? So, for example, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, a fairly significant fear of communism in the United States as a dominant political, economic, social philosophy. So there was this war of ideologies between U.S. liberal capitalism, U.S.-style liberal capitalism, and Soviet-style communism. there was this idea of something called the domino theory regarding Asia and Europe and other parts of the world, which simply said if Vietnam falls completely to communism, then Cambodia will fall and Laos will fall, Burma will fall, perhaps India will fall. They will all fall just like dominoes on a table, one after another, to communism, and we can't allow that to happen. So whether that was rational or not, that was a real thought. And Clemens and Macbeth didn't mention this, but one of the irrational ways of approaching something rational is making the measurement the mission. There was a what was used by the Department of Defense in Vietnam was something called body count. So when American forces went out and engaged the enemy, they would estimate a body count, literally, the number of Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldiers that were killed. Well, body count, by some historians' estimation, became the entire focus of the mission itself. So if you could increase the body count, you're doing well. Well, when your measurement becomes your mission, it becomes irrational. There are some very famous cases about in criminology of police departments using tracking mechanisms to track crime, but at some point the measures themselves becoming the mission of the police department. So increasing arrests or decreasing arrests, whatever it is they're trying to do, that becomes the mission. So that is actually an irrational way of approaching a rational measurement. And so if war is partly rational, partly political, partly ideological, what about the other wars we say we're going to fight? Like from the 1960s, also President Johnson's war on poverty. And it's not just wars. How do we smuggle in ideology, wishful thinking, biases into otherwise rational analysis? Think of the building of sports and multi-purpose arenas in cities. There's a lot of literature on that. You can look it up. But, here in the Omaha area, in the suburb town of Ralston, they built an arena. And at this point, in 2017, the city of Ralston is having trouble paying their bonds on that multi-purpose arena. Why? Because they probably inserted wishful thinking into their otherwise rational analysis, having to do with what kind of revenue this arena was going to generate from sports events and concerts and other things. It was greatly oversold. So how about policies on economic development? If we provide tax incentives to particular businesses, they will build in certain areas, and other businesses will come along and fill up the vacant office spaces, and the city will make a lot of money on tax dollars. Well, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But the point is, a lot of those analyses feature a lot of rational looking numbers, but one of the issues is we have to know what was inside those numbers, just like when we do a cost-benefit analysis. And so what are non-rational explanations for why policy gets made? And Clemens and Macbeth talk about some of these, and I think we've talked about these before, but a few theories of the policy process, like group theory, which says some groups have influence and access out of proportion to the size of their group. Maybe it's because of funding or other things. And so if that's the case, then are the policy decisions that come from that kind of influence rational? Incrementalism. Way back in 1959, theorist named Charles Lindblom, talked about muddling through. What he said was, when it comes to national policy, we simply muddle through. And what he meant by that was that opposing sides had visions of what national policy should look like, but in order to just move forward, there was a lot of compromise, and we ended up muddling through. And he especially talked about budgets, and his contention was that at the national level, and the same can be said to hold true at the city level or the state level, that often legislators and legislatures, what they do with budgets is they simply say, oh, well, if the budget last year was $1,000, let's increase it by 3% and make it $1,030, and so on. We'll do this every single year. And Lindblom said that actually, sometimes that's desirable. I mean, other theorists have come along and said that incrementalism doesn't always happen. However, you can observe incrementalism, especially when it comes to budgets at the local level. Incremental increases every year. Is that rational? Is it rational to say we're gonna increase all agencies by 3%, or like in Nebraska this year, we're going to decrease all agencies by 3%? Is that rational, or is that just based on some view of incrementalism? Elite theory. Uh, in other words, the few with power make decisions, and those decisions might not always be rational. There are plenty of other ways of looking at policy. There are institutional explanations. A theorist named Niskanen in 1975, and I don't have him cited here, but he basically said that agencies at the federal level, he was writing about the federal level, had information superiority to members of Congress. And so they could say, well, we need this kind of increase, and members of Congress would listen to them. But the problem with that approach is that the institutions themselves have an institutional bias, not a big picture bias. And so is that rational? Policy advocates can form coalitions. Policy advocates who otherwise might disagree on many things might agree on certain aspects of policy and form a coalition to push for their view. Is that rational? Or is that kind of a political view? External crises may cause policy change. Were the U.S. responses to 9/11 completely rational? So you can make these kinds of arguments, and people do, and write a lot of journal articles over them. But the point is that every decision taken is not completely rational. And so a lot of this has to do with how we view the world, right? I mean, the kind of research that we do and the way we approach problems has to do with how we view the world. And so there are two terms in academia that we like to employ. One is called ontology, and the other is epistemology. Ontology just means this is how the world works. And epistemology says, and this is how I find out about how the world works. So there's really they uh, identify three different kinds of ontologies. There's more really, but these three um, are the basic ones. So positivism, postmodernism, and postpositivism. So what is positivism? Positivism just means that there are no non-metaphysical facts or realities in the world. What exists in the world is what we can observe in the physical world. That is how things work, and those facts are actually outside. They are objective and outside of our subjective reality. So, gravity is external to me, but it has an effect on me, and I can discover gravity really um, by jumping off a building, or I could do another kind of experiment that might be less harmful to me. So the way our epistemology is is to find studies that we say operate in a fair and neutral way. So the best kinds of research, if you have this epistemology, are a scientific method that kind of follows a natural science approach to research, experiments if you can do them, but deductive reasoning, going from theory to specific, and testing hypotheses about your your particular thing that you're studying. And the goal really of this kind of epistemology is always generalization. So if I can do a rigorous enough experiment on classroom size and K-12 education in a couple of places, then I can generalize, from that locale to the rest of public education. And then the job of other positivist researchers is to come along and test my hypotheses and say, well, you're wrong or you're right, or you should add here or detract there. Um, so what is postmodernism, which gets talked about all the time? Well, postmodernism really is this idea that there aren't universal truths, that truth and meaning are found in particular communities of belief, right? And so how do we discover those? We discover those through language. So postmodernists are very big into the deconstruction of language. And so when we do that, When we deconstruct the codes and the symbols that we all use in our languages, we discover contradictions and assumptions. And generalization is difficult, if not impossible. And then post-positivism, which is sort of, walking a middle line there, that we say Berger and Luckman talked about the social construction of reality way back in 1967. And so, one would say the world is not simply physical, but it's also socially constructed. That is, the way humans interact socially, we have over time, over centuries really, and millennia, we have constructed the way humans interact with each other culturally, the way we do it with language, the way we do it in institutions. And so we have this intersubjectivity, uh, an intersubjective reality between humans. And so how do we discover that? Well, we do that largely through qualitative methods, right? Such as field research, going into the field in organizations or with cultures, doing content analysis of texts, right? Looking at newspaper articles, looking at the kinds of messages that organizations put out. We do it with focus groups. Marketing really is kind of a post-positivist approach, right? Marketing, uh, the whole purpose of marketing focus groups really, and there's the one with I guess it's the Chevy vehicles, right, that you've seen on TV. That's kind of a hyped version, but um, calling people together and saying, look, if I show you this car, what do you feel? If I show you this other car that's a competitor, what do you feel? What are the features of car A that you really like or hate? What are the features of car B that you really like or hate? And so really what they're looking for is focus groups is people's subjective connection with reality, right? And you can use statistical methods then to sort of put that together. And so some generalization is possible, but it's approach that says, what is real to people is not just the physical world, but things that they socially construct. So what does that have to do with anything? And why is that thrown in there? The reason that's thrown in there is because it speaks to the difficulty of always using just a positivist approach to uh, policy analysis. So as I'm getting to this, again, let me just remind you. I mean, I think Clemens and Macbeth sort of have a bent, which is fine. Um, I certainly am not implying that I have that bent. I'm also not implying that you should have that bent. Um, because when it comes to policy analysis, I think there are many ways of evaluating the worth and the effectiveness of certain kinds of policy. And some of them are very positivist, some are post-positivist. Um, and so I want you to realize that we can evaluate policy from many different perspectives, and in fact, we should. But in this chapter, in chapter 4 of the reading, they are talking about problems with the positivist approach. So let me just talk about some of those they mentioned. They have about 4 or 5 of these broad categories. One is intellectual and analytical critiques. And under this, they identify two, the human problem and the analytical problem. I put the quotes on these next 5 or 6 slides. The quotes aren't exact, but I'm quoting them to let you know the pages I got most of this from, because I want to give them credit and citation here. But, the human problem is that there are limits to the human capacity to comprehend. This is what Simon was talking about when he talked about bounded rationality back in 1957. So we use models and metaphors and other techniques to impose structure on the world, right? And we come up with frames of reference so that we can reduce reality in order to understand it and in order to talk about it. And we talked about this idea of narrative policy analysis a couple of weeks ago, and we use stories, right? We use stories to explain the world and to explain policy, and also to exclude other people's stories and other group stories. So the human problem is that we are bounded in our rationality. The analytical problem is that problems are complex, time is limited, and we often emphasize short-term thinking at the expense of long-term thinking, right? So emphasizing short-term thinking at the expense of long-term thinking, that's what we were doing last week, doing a cost-benefit analysis with discount rates. So even though a cost-benefit analysis is some math, and using discount rates as math, actually the assignment of discount rate is kind of subjective. A person who discounts the future heavily, has a high personal discount rate, is going to want money right now, um, and is going to be prone to realize that the net present value of money, the greatest net present value, is right this moment, and they're less willing to accept projects in the future that are going to cost them money. Um, so problems are complex. We have a lot of data, or we don't have enough data. But now, these days, we can get a lot of data. But which data do we use? And time is limited. So we know that the book by Bardak talks about time being limited, especially for a busy policy analysis who works for someone in the legislature. Your time is limited, and so you have to do the best you can sometimes with limited time. So what are the cognitive critiques that Clemens and Macbeth talk about? Well, they're just talking about the way that we as humans think. We as humans, a lot of psychology analysis has shown that we tend to think tribally. We tend to think in groups. Um, and so we do something often called the devil shift. The devil shift actually is something that Sabatier and Hank Jenkins Smith came up with when they talk about the advocacy coalition framework. You can look that up. But what they talk about the devil shift is they say one coalition uh, who wants uh, a certain outcome from a policy will ascribe just the worst motives to the other coalition, their opposing coalition, and thereby be unwilling to negotiate with them. So, you know, if if I want this clean water bill and you don't want the clean water bill, I'm going to simply say I'm going to write you off as a person who, doesn't care about future generations, doesn't care about clean water, is evil in your approach. None of that may or may not be true. Um, the point is that we do this devil shift, and it limits our ability to solve problems. How about political and institutional critiques? Well, what they're talking about here is the nature of the political system and the nature of the organizations. So our political system in the United States, by design, in fact, has checks and balances. People do often complain about the way our political system works. They say that it's inefficient. Well, actually, if you go back to 80-50 again and think about this, um, you might have talked about this. Our three branch federal government, which has been copied at most of the state levels and copied in to some extent at most city levels, purposely separates power. Ambition should be made to counteract ambition. That's from Federalist 51, I think. Um, so, you know, it is fragmented. It's divided power between branches. It's divided power between the national government and the state government. Um, so we have structural democracy in most places, and then we have some flaws in that structural democracy. So the nature of the political system often impedes um, the rational model and rational decision making. And then the nature of organizations themselves. So here I'm talking about public organizations. Um, Large departments at the federal government level, like the Department of Defense, or even small departments at your city, like the Parks Department. Um, you know, Decision makers are guided by rules, and these rules tend to create organizational cultures. And so organizational cultures often affect the way people in the organization look at problems. Um, People from the Defense Department and people from the State Department might view things slightly differently, right? People from the Public Works Department at your city might view things differently than people from your Parks Department in the city. The most efficient route for a sewer line might be through the middle of a golf course. But if you're in the Parks Department, you probably don't want the trenching going on in the middle of a fairway in the summer to build a sewer line. So the nature of organizations does impede the rational approach. How about ideological and physical critiques? This gets down to data. And one of the things I've done this semester, I've had you look at um, some different policy analyses from the partisan perspective. And there's the one tab on the Blackboard site where I list a lot of different organizations that do policy analysis. Take a look at those as we're going along through the course, but take a look at them this week, perhaps, and understand that different organizations use the same data in different ways, right? How do they do that? Well, they dress up their facts differently. They use different kinds of charts and graphs. They use a lot of techniques to get their point across using the same facts. And I think you've probably discovered that already. But does that impede the rational model? Yes, it certainly does. Okay, so what? I babbled about that for several minutes, and the question is, so what? Well, the other reading I assigned to you was Craft Chapter 6. And this is a chart from Craft Chapter 6 on page 175. So what is this chart? Craft talks about this in Chapter 6, all of these 8 ways of evaluating a policy proposal. So what are these things? These are actually criteria of evaluation. And as you know, on March 18th, you're going to outline some of your criteria of evaluation. Now, these are kind of broad categories, and inside each of these broad categories, you can think of specific criteria, but these are broad categories of criteria that can apply to a policy problem. So if you look at those, I'm not going to point out which are which, but you'll see that some of these tend to be more from a rationalist perspective, right? And some of them tend to be more from a political perspective. These ways of looking at a problem. So compare, efficiency, which is getting the most outputs for a unit of input, with liberty and freedom. Well, how do you do that? How do you evaluate liberty and freedom? There are ways to do that. Technical feasibility, if you're doing a project on IT, if you're setting up, if you need to set up a server organization, a server farm for your city, you would evaluate that from a technical perspective. The amount of data that you have to handle, the bandwidth that you need, you would actually be able to do a technical feasibility analysis there, right? And then again, social acceptability. If I want to build this community center, is it acceptable to the public? And so you can see that each of these criteria are coming at evaluating a problem or a proposal from a slightly different perspective. And this, in fact, is what we're driving at with our own projects. How are you evaluating your alternatives? So this week, we're away from exercises, and I want us to get back to our sort of more traditional post question respond discussion. And so it's the typical post something by Tuesday, post critiques to at least 2 people by Thursday, and then respond to at least one of those critiques or questions by Saturday. And this is what I want you to do. I want to give you each a chance to share with the class your problem statement, what your problem is about. And then I want you to write about 2 alternatives to your problem. And these don't actually necessarily have to be the same alternatives that you use when you turn in the March 18th step of your project. And they don't have to be as fully fleshed out, but you should talk about, here's 2 ways we can I can solve this policy problem. And then from those 8 criteria on page 175 of the Craft book, figure 6.1, select a couple of those criteria that you would use to evaluate those 2 alternatives and how you would use those criteria. How you would, for example, if you said, I want to evaluate these alternatives based on political feasibility. Well, how would you do that? So that's what I want you to talk about in your Tuesday post. And then by Thursday, take a couple of classmates and examine what they said and ask them some specific questions about did they consider other alternatives, or offer some comments or opinions on the criteria that they did offer. And then by Saturday, of course, I want you to respond to at least one of those critiques. So that is it for this week. Again, I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I hope that this is useful for you as you are still formatting your next phase of the project. Thank you.